And we're back in the car like we never left. Welcome to the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your Tuesday early evening here with me in New York. But once again, we're going to skip past all that promotional jazz and get right to the guts of the episode. So we're not going to talk about movies today. This will be another, hopefully, entertaining episode more in a personal vein. My dad's dad, my grandfather, Nathan Cohen, was born August 12th, 1913. So that would be 112 years ago. Now, he lived a very long life. We all thought that he was going to make it to 100, but he didn't. He made it to 96, and he died in January of 2010. It was ultimately pancreatic cancer which got him. And he had apparently been sick for quite some time, but when you get into your 80s and 90s, the metabolism is different, and he didn't know that he was coming to the end until almost the end. My grandfather's life, from a certain perspective, is an incredible success story. And, you know, both of my grandfathers, and this is where just saying a phrase isn't enough. You have to kind of go deeper and explain, at least for someone like myself who thrives on nuance. I am Mr. Nuance. I'm not as interested in it's got to be this or this. I like explanations. I like to be very precise with my language. You know, I don't like making mistakes, giving you information, such and such a movie's on Netflix when it's actually not on Netflix. But just for perspective, it is a true statement to say that my dad's dad, Nathan Cohen, who would have turned 112 today, but he did celebrate 96 birthdays on terra firma, he was old school tough. So whatever that means to you, he was old school tough. Now, my mom's father, Isidore Breitkopf, but you didn't call him Isidore, you called him Baron. People who called him Isidore usually ended up in the hospital. He was also old school tough. It didn't mean the same for one as the other. My mom's father was a mobster. My mom's father worked directly for Meyer Lansky. You can Google that. He was a big name in the Jewish mob. He was old school tough in the sense of fists and presumably low-tech weaponry and busting someone's head open if they didn't pay a debt. Nathan Cohen, on the other hand, was old school tough in that he took lemons and just kept making lemonade. You're not supposed to have the start that he had and end up with the life that he lived. Now, he did have great genetics. There can be no doubt about that. My grandfather, and this is so absurd, he had an extra heart valve. Now, nobody knew that, because why would you ever check somebody out in, the 60s, 70s, or 80s? Why would you give them the kind of test to find out how many valves they have in their heart? We have 5. Well, my grandfather, when he was retiring, he was 66 and on his way to Florida. Literally, he had retired. He was on his way to Florida. He had a heart attack on the plane, or he had what he thought was really bad indigestion. He decided to get himself checked out. And lo and behold, Mr. Cohen, you seem to have had a cardiac event, which we could, I guess, call a heart attack, but you're perfectly fine. Oh, well, that's good news. Well, do you know what happened? It seems as if you had a blockage in one of your arteries. Oh, well, I feel okay now. Well, yeah, you do feel okay now. And you know why you feel okay now? Because, Mr. Cohen, you have a genetic anomaly. You have 6 heart valves. And it appears that the 6th valve had been laying dormant until about 4 hours ago, when one of your 5 stopped working. Valve number 6 began pumping blood. You did your own bypass. Your body performed its own bypass. The cardiologist couldn't get over that, and he laughed, and he said in his career he had heard of it with other people, but he personally had never seen it or witnessed it. So Nathan Cohen was not like anyone else. So he grew up, and the cliche in this instance, my mom's father grew up on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, it had a very high concentration of Jewish people, but something that a lot of people don't know, even among those who know what I just said, is that in the first part of the 20th century, Harlem had a very high percentage of Jewish people. My grandfather, who was born in this country, it was his parents who emigrated over here, and my aunt actually has the paperwork, the documentation of them coming over from Ellis Island. The family name was not Cohen 150 years ago. It was Kagan, Kagan. But Kagan is an Eastern European derivation of Cohen. So Kagan, Cohen, same thing. So my grandfather grew up in Jewish Harlem in a tenement, a real lousy building, lousy living conditions. He did not ever know his father. My great-grandfather on that side of the family, apparently his name was Meyer, and he was either a degenerate gambler, a raging alcoholic, or he was just severely mentally ill, or some combination of those three. You understand, obviously, this is all lost to history. Nobody knows this for sure, because Meyer presumably was born 1880, 1885, something like that. So we don't exactly know, but what we do know is Nathan Cohen never knew his father. And his mother died in the 1918 flu pandemic. So it was on my Aunt Eva, who I did get to know. She was the eldest of the siblings. Aunt Eva more or less raised my grandfather. And they were dirt poor. I know that's a cliche, but they were dirt poor. They barely had enough to eat. And this is before the Great Depression. But my grandfather figured out a way to graduate quite strongly from Monroe High School. And, he didn't have the opportunities that, let's just say, his grandson would later have. He didn't have the luxury of even pondering, well, maybe I could go to college in the city, or because he already showed aptitudes, that he was not like everyone else. He was very slow on the uptake as far as wanting to understand everything. He wasn't interested in surface. He was interested in details because he wanted to know how things worked so that maybe someday he could do that. He could work that. But he ended up, as it turned out, he had a really good pair of hands. My grandfather was the prototype for the MacGyver, the idea of give this guy a pocket knife and an instruction packet and he'll build you a Home Depot. Now, he never actually did that, but he was really good with his hands. So he ended up working in a machine shop. He worked in a machine shop for many years. The money was okay. I mean, we're not talking about making a fantastic living. But he made airplane parts. He made airplane parts more or less by hand. The safety protocols, not surprisingly, I mean, there are issues now, but 100, well, maybe 90 years ago, safety protocols were even worse. And he was fortunate not to have suffered any horrendous injuries working with hot saws and lathes and all of the kinds of things that you would still be using today, but you would use them under much more optimal conditions. But he worked for a company. It wasn't Grumman, but it was a company affiliated with Grumman. So he actually worked in Bethpage, which isn't really very far from where I grew up in Massapequa. But Nathan Cohen was a people person, and he had a gruff exterior. He had a very stern manner. He didn't seem like a guy who would necessarily be very warm and or paternal, but he was. You just had to kind of get to know him a little bit. You had to, the onion thing that Donkey talks about in Shrek. You just had to peel the layers back a little bit to realize that, wow, this is a real prince of a guy. And the thing is, when people end up in business, and there are so many stories, you look at the famous restaurateur, was it Silvio Macchioni, the guy who created Le Cirque? I think it was Macchioni was his name. But you say, well, how did a guy like that end up owning this multi-millionaire or multi-million dollar restaurant? A lot of it is being a people person and learning how to do a lot of different things really well, but ingratiating yourselves with people, showing people that they can trust you with whatever it might be, and that you are highly competent, that you're very good at whatever it is that you're doing. So my grandfather ended up meeting my grandmother, Irene Weinstein, later Irene Cohen, who unfortunately has been gone for more than 3 decades. And I don't want to get bogged down in, talking about my grandmother, but next to my parents and my sister, that is my next favorite person was Grandma Irene. She was like a second mom to me. But my grandparents met and they got together, and Grandma Irene was also from, Grandma Irene was from the Bronx. And Grandpa, at that point, he had moved to the Bronx by that point. And I don't even remember how they met, but they got together. And I remember asking him, because at this point in my life, I hadn't really had a relationship myself. I hadn't even been close. I said, well, what was it like with you and Grandma all those years ago, getting together in the 30s? And, he said a lot of stuff. He was very vague. He didn't really want to go into the nitty gritty of what day-to-day living was like back then. It couldn't have been that good. But they both worked, and they got married in 39. And my father was born in 42. And my aunt, who is still doing well, she's in her late 70s now, she was born in 46. So technically my aunt, of all of the people close to me that I'm related to, she's the only one who is a boomer. My father was born in 42. My mom was born in 45. And my mom's brother, Uncle Jeffrey, who unfortunately also has passed, he was also born in 42. So my aunt, 1946, was technically a boomer, although it had nothing to do with the baby boom. The idea of the baby boom is when the young soldiers came home from World War II, and then that's why 1946, like that's not an accidental year that the baby boom generation starts in 46. So my grandfather and grandmother had normal jobs, and they made enough where my dad would have said to his last day, we never wanted for anything. Grandma worked in a toy store. Grandpa was still working in a machine shop. They did the best they could. And by that point, they were living in a decent apartment in the Bronx. And my Uncle Sidney, my grandma's brother, lived in the same building. And his story is a bit tragic because he was almost mortally wounded in World War II. He enlisted, and my Uncle Albert, grandma's other brother, also enlisted. He took a pretty bad wound, but nothing like Uncle Sidney, who walked with a limp, and he suffered a head injury. He got shot in the head, literally got shot in the head, and it's almost miraculous that he was able to live a full life after that. But he got military pension, and he was very generous, so that the family they were starting to get more of a toehold where they weren't really living paycheck to paycheck. They were doing okay. And I don't know if they had any savings at that point, but Nathan Cohen was able to make a lot of friends, and he had a best friend named Harold. And I grew up, I didn't have that many cousins. I had 3 cousins on my mother's side. Unfortunately, 2 of them are gone now. But on my dad's mom's side, there were a lot of cousins. And I grew up with this other family. It's like they were all cousins, because my grandfather's best friend, a gentleman named Harold, they were able to go into business for themselves. And a big part of the reason, and this is where I say when you say talk about someone being self-made or a sole proprietor building a business out of nowhere, that happens. But you ask the questions, how did it happen? What allowed them to do that, or what allowed him or her to make the first move? Did they inherit money? And there's nothing wrong with that at all. Did they take out a big loan that paid off? Did they make some kind of a crazy gamble in the stock market that paid off? Like, how did they get into the business in the first place? How were they not just people making a normal living at a 9-to-5? How do you become a business owner? How do you become a business owner now? But how did you become a business owner in the late 1950s without having any real startup capital? How does that work? Well, my grandfather, when he was in his 40s, and his friend Harold had a brother-in-law who was in real estate, and he had a lot of different, he had money in a lot of different areas, but he also had a lot of tenants that he communicated with. And it doesn't matter if he was friends with tenants, but he talked to a lot of people. And as luck would have it, sometime in about 1959, a gentleman who owned and operated a bowling alley and nightclub, Long Island, about as far west and south as you can go on Long Island, Woodmere. He was leaving the business. And this guy saw an opportunity for these two men, my grandfather and his best friend. And they went for it. They went for it. And that turned out to be a boon. It turned out to be an incredible stroke of good fortune. So that's where I say people would have called, and they did, and they weren't trying to insult anybody else. They would say, Nathan, well, he was always known as Nat. Nat is a self-made man. Look, he came from nothing, and look at what he made of his life. Well, yes, look at what he made of his life, but he didn't do it by himself. If he did not know one person who knew another person, he would have been working in the machine shop maybe for the next decade until something else came along. I don't think he was going to be there forever, but the point is, he only got to be a business owner because he knew somebody who knew somebody, and he showed incredible aptitudes. There are people now, nobody's going to come on this podcast to talk about this, but there are people now who worked with my grandfather in the bowling alley that will say, your grandpa was not just okay, he wasn't just competent. It wasn't that he knew how to do a lot of different things. It was that everything he tried, he was great at it. Put a crossword puzzle in front of him, he's going to finish it faster than anybody. There's an issue on lane 6, he's going to fix it faster than any mechanic. You know, you think about it, bowling alleys, again, whether it's now or whether it's then, they are mechanical. They're mechanical. Yeah, you have automatic scorers and automatic lane recyclers and all of that, but it's still mechanical. My grandfather's background as a machinist is another reason why this was a perfect gig. They didn't have to hire an extra mechanic or two because they had probably the best mechanic, well, first in the Bronx, but now in Woodmere. He's here. He's right here. Yeah, Nat, lane 6, there's an issue. 2 minutes later, there's no issue. So it turned out that the bowling alley business, it took off from there. That was also a stroke of good fortune, because this is something that people of the generation before my parents, if there are any who are still around, that you know, bowling alleys they're not the same now, and they haven't been the same since the 60s as they had been previously. They were looked upon almost as bars and taverns and pool halls. They weren't seen as family-friendly establishments until right around 1960. And so they got into that business. They could not have picked a better time to get into the bowling alley and nightclub business. And Grandpa's partner was comfortable running the bar. He had a bartender's license, and and so my grandpa had to get that also. But he handled one end of the business, and my grandfather handled the other. Now, one of the family ironies, everyone in my family bowled. Both sides of the family. The people on my mother's side, they didn't know any of this because my parents didn't meet for another decade. But my dad ended up being a great bowler. My mom was already a great bowler. My dad's mom, Grandma Irene, was pretty good. My father was a terrific bowler. He'd get his back problems, which unfortunately was a big part of his later life. That's what stopped him from bowling. My dad at his best was probably a 185, 190 average back when that meant something, before reactive resonance scoring just went berserk in the 90s. My mom's brother, Jeff, was this close to being pro level. That's how good of a bowler he was. Grandpa Barron, my mom's father, was a phenomenal bowler. And Grandma Gertrude, mom's mom, fantastic. The only person, and I was a pretty good bowler. I got to bowl in the state finals, high school, in 1991. The only person in either side of the family who couldn't bowl was Grandpa Nat. He wasn't interested. He owned the business. He ran the business. He just didn't bowl. He didn't give a shit. He didn't find it entertaining at all. He was happier just reading than going out there on the lanes and bowling. But I asked him once, I said, what were some of the things that caused you to be able to do so well, to make so much money, given the 60s and 70s? What was it? He said, well, we had a lot. We were the only game in town. I don't think there were any bowling alleys for a significant amount of square mileage from the 5 towns, at least at that time. They had a reputation for having fair prices, and the food was good. There's a snack bar that's still there, and a grill, and then I think they had a kitchen where they could serve different food in the nightclub, which was called a spare room, and then it was called and it's still called Backstage to this day. But the food was really good. Grandpa apparently had certain things. He put different additives with the food, and people loved it. I mean, this is so ridiculous, but like, he would put a little bit of sugar and a little bit of lemon juice in the tuna fish, and people became addicted to the tuna fish sandwiches. He did something with the butter that he would add to the cornbread. People like, my God, Nat, this is the best cornbread I've ever had. He added something else. I forgot what it was. It could have been like Old Bay seasoning, but he added something to the French fries. Like, he was always looking for a way to enhance the experience. So they were able to put together a lot of men's leagues where men, they would sometimes bring their wives, the kids would come along. Grandpa didn't have a problem with that. People would order a ton of food. They'd order a lot of booze. And he also said, little kid birthday parties, Junior, little kid birthday parties. You'd be surprised how much money you can make with the little kid birthday parties, because the adults come in and this guy's brother and friend, and they order food and they order booze, and we just made out like bandits, kiddo. We made out like bandits. So that was my grandfather's life in the 60s, and they moved from the Bronx to Far Rockaway, and then they moved from Far Rockaway to Rockville Center, which is, Nassau County. It's still Nassau County. Woodmere is technically still Nassau County. You're almost on the Queens border. Like, you're not that far from Cambria Heights over there. You're really not that far. They moved to Rockville Center. They had a nice apartment. And by that point, their son, my father, had gotten married. And I was born in December 1973. And I don't know that either of my grandparents thought that my dad was ever going to have the life that he had. Not because he wasn't capable, not because he wasn't hyper competent. They knew he was going to be able to make money. He showed also very significant aptitudes in areas where you say, okay, well, this doesn't make sense that he's this good at Scrabble when he's 11 years old and no adults can even give him a game. My dad had a lot of things that he was great at where you just scratched your head. He didn't look the part, but he did, and he was. But he was very awkward. And somehow, that awkward kid, that my old man, who died at the same age as his mom, he died at 79. They were both just shy of their 80th birthdays when they passed. That awkward kid met my mother, and they got married in 1970. And in 73, I came along. And I don't think that my grandparents believed that they were ever going to have grandchildren. Or if they did, they never talked about it. They saw me as a miracle child. And another cliche, the Jewish grandparents spoiling their grandkid. But I like to think that Grandpa Nat and Grandma Irene, they were not the stereotypical Jewish grandparents. They were the prototypes. They were the exact prototypes. Grandma Irene was always baking cookies, was making mandel bread, was cooking everything. She didn't even enjoy cooking. She just knew that people thought she was a good cook, so she cooked. I didn't even like stuffed cabbage except when she made it. I didn't really like chopped liver except when she made it. They spoiled me rotten. With gifts, yes. I got video game systems that I wouldn't have had. I got handheld video games like state-of-the-art 1982 handheld video games because they just couldn't help it. They were so happy they had a grandkid. They didn't see that one coming. They didn't expect that. And they were so happy. But they moved to Florida. Grandpa retired in 1979. He suffered a pretty significant injury in 78. Such a really stupid injury. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen in bowling alleys where they cook the French fries. It's like a hot fryer, and the fries, generally speaking, now I don't know that every bowling alley does this, but most that I have been to in my life, whether, Massapequa or Huntington, even Coram Lanes near where I am now, the fryer, it's hot oil. It's hot oil. The French fries aren't made there in almost all cases. They come out of the freezer and it's hot oil. Well, I don't know how this happened. It's only one time in 20 years of my grandfather doing this. He splashed hot oil on his foot and he suffered a significant burn. And it was bad enough where, are we going to lose the toe or is it going to be permanent? He did not walk with a limp. That's what they were most afraid of. Is he going to walk with a limp? Once he recovered, he was okay. But not long after he had the scare with the foot, he started not feeling well. And what I mentioned about him having a heart attack on the plane, he thought he was dying. He was 65. He thought that he was 65 going on 66. He thought he was dying. Because back then, Here's another cliche. People lived harder because life was harder. My grandfather had a very difficult life, and he thought he was coming to the end. And so he was calculating, does it even make sense to go to Florida? Because maybe I only have a year, and maybe I won't get to see my grandson again. I won't get to see my son again. I won't get to see my fantastic daughter-in-law. I won't get to see my daughter who lived in the city. He thought he was coming to the end. But he was sick. He was slowly getting a blockage in one of his arteries. And that's why he was feeling like shit. He recovered from the foot. So when they moved down to Florida, 1980, and it was tough on me, and my grandmother was weeping all the time from what I was told because she missed her grandson. I used to spend one day of the week with her. She was amazing. God, I was so spoiled. I did appreciate them though. It's not like I don't like them. No, I did. And I missed them when they moved away. But one of the many ironies of my grandfather's life is he got a full retirement, and he got as much out of retirement as you possibly can. He had a 30-year retirement where he had good health for almost all the way. He had heart issues, and he actually had open heart surgery in 96, and then he had another somewhat minor procedure in 2005. But excepting those cardiac issues, he was like an Iron Man. He was still walking with me, doing uphill walking in the early 2000s when he was 90. Well, no, at that point he would have been in his upper 80s. It wasn't until he came to visit when I was still living with my dad in Huntington in 2006. We celebrated his 93rd birthday, and there's a really good family picture. I wish my mom had been in there, but of course my parents had been divorced for so many years. By that point, he couldn't walk as briskly as he had even a few years earlier. You know, age finally caught up to him. He had to get into his 90s for age to catch up to him. But he still, even as my grandmother passed in 94, he mourned. You know, he was 80, 81 when she died. He mourned, but he went on living. You know, he was a get busy living or get busy dying. He wouldn't have said that. You know, maybe when he watched the movie The Shawshank Redemption, he saw a little bit of himself, but he kept on living. There wasn't any reason for him to cash in his chips. And the fact that he had good health for another 15 years after my grandmother passed. And please forgive me for what I'm about to say. Nathan Cohen outlived 4 girlfriends. They were all younger than him. He outlived them all. He was still active a month before he died. He was still driving at 96. He was still paying all of his bills by check on time every month. He was still doing the Sun Sentinel crossword every day. He was still getting such a kick out of life and such a kick out of TV shows and movies when he would go to the movies. He took every day and acted as if it was a gift. He didn't talk like that. He was not a big speaker. He was a storyteller, but he was not one who was prone to exaggeration. He was very blunt. But as I said, he had a heart of gold. And the really gutting thing, I'm sorry if I start to get emotional, I apologize. Again, there aren't that many people who, when I speak, that I do get emotional over them. Nathan Cohen is one of them. But this isn't for the reason that you think. So we got word that he had pancreatic cancer early in January of 2010. And my dad wasn't that surprised. When I say he wasn't that surprised, Grandpa had shown symptoms that there was something wrong. And when you get to be 95 and you suddenly complain that you don't have any appetite, you know it's got to be something. You don't want to doom and gloom, but he's 95 years old, for crying out loud. So we got word that he had pancreatic cancer, and they didn't know how much time he had left. We got to go. We got to go. So we went to, my dad and I, we flew to Fort Lauderdale. My mom already lived in Fort Lauderdale. And when my father had his disaster in 2005, my dad was only 62 and he broke his hip and fractured several bones in his spine and was stuck in traction for 8 weeks. And then he lived with my grandfather, who was already 92 years old, 91 going on 92. And Grandpa nursed him back to health. That's what I mean. When he was, They broke the mold when they created him, nursing his son back to health at 91 going on 92. Totally absurd, but it's true. But my mother and father, they never got back together, but they were best friends by this point. They probably didn't even remember why they hated each other, when they were together, that kind of thing. Maybe they didn't hate each other, but you get my point. But Mom lived in Florida. She lived about 10 minutes from Grandpa. So we went down, and I didn't realize until I got there that this was it. This man who had been like a second father to me, somebody who I held in such high esteem, this was it. He's going to die. Like soon. It could be days. And unfortunately, this is a part of life, the cycle of life. We get older, we die. Hopefully we don't suffer too much. And he didn't suffer that much. He wasn't in pain. His skin got yellow. It was just like you would see in the movies. It was bad. He wasn't in pain. It's just his body started to shut down after 96 years. It had had enough. It had had enough. So I had to absorb him on the phone saying goodbye to people, because he didn't know if he even had more than a couple of days. And there were people who would have wanted to see him who weren't going to be able to. And even though he got just about as much out of life as you possibly can, he was, even with all the money that he spent on my grandmother who needed constant care towards the end of her life, even with all of the money that he spent on that, he still was able to leave my father a good amount. And my dad was always grateful that he had such a home run hitter for a father. But he wasn't ready to go. That's the thing that hurt the most, that cut the deepest. 96 years. He wasn't ready to go. He was sad. He was terribly sad. And that is something that will haunt me for the rest of my days, for sure. That if you can get this much out of life, that you could spend so much time and then so much money on the people you love, still be able to give significant amounts to those who came after you, that you can light the victory cigar. I couldn't have done this any better. I did right by my bride. I did right by my son. I did right by my daughter. I did right by my grandkids. I did everything that I could in this life. He still wasn't ready to go. He wasn't ready. But boy, was he tough. The fact that he survived that heart attack on the plane and just performed his own bypass. The fact that when my grandmother died, that he just picked himself up and went back to life. Because we only get one shot at this. And he took that seriously. He took that to heart, literally. That he wasn't going to leave anything on the table. His body simply gave out. After 96 years and just about 30 years of incredible, wonderful retirement, meeting so many people in Florida that, hey, if he had lived in New York, he made so many friends and he outlived all of them. This is what happens. But 96 years. Nathan Cohen, born August 12th, 1913, died January 23rd, 2010. My grandfather, a really extraordinary human being and a really good guy. Sorry. This has been episode 591 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all so much for spending some of this emotional, admittedly, episode about my grandfather on the anniversary of what would have been his 112th birthday here with me in New York. And if you check out this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Podbean, Spotify, iTunes, or the others in which we're hosted, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with a new episode real soon. Till then, peace.